Washington Journal continues.
Congressman Jeff Fortenberry is with us. He represents the 1st District in Nebraska. He's a member of the House Appropriations Committee. Here with us this morning to talk about a number of issues, including federal spending. Congressman Fortenberry, welcome to Washington Journal.
Good morning, Bill. Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
It is the spending season, the budget season on Capitol Hill. So let's start there with the president's proposed budget so far. Overall, what is your impression of what the president is asking for?
Well, I think it's important to walk through a little bit of insider process here. The president proposes a budget, but Congress can ignore it, take part of it, do what we want. It's ultimately Congress's decision. The president's budget greatly accelerates spending. It has massive amounts of new debt that has to be financed. And more importantly, I think, is the philosophical divide that exists in the country. Are we going to centralize more and more government in Washington, or are we going to let America run more as we traditionally have through a federal process where there are states and locales and other forms of community associations that take care of problems? Being on the Appropriations Committee, we are actively engaged across 12 separate categories of public policy. We're in charge of basically funding those areas, and I'm the ranking member of Agriculture. It's one of those 12 bills that we'll work on through this month and hopefully come to some consensus around that. But it's going to be hard to get to any type of consensus with this level of massive spending and centralization of more and more federal government in the hands of the Washington, D.C. establishment. This is the deep divide.
It seems like president after president, Congress after Congress, that we have trouble getting a hold on the deficit in this country. Just the latest figures on the president's proposed budget. His budget projects a deficit above $1 trillion for the rest of the decade. It projects a 5% growth in the economy for this year, however, and estimates the growth over the next year 4.3% and 2% for the rest of the decade. Do you think those figures by the administration are too optimistic?
Well, any administration's got to defend its own proposal, and we all hope that economic growth and opportunity flourishes in our society so that all persons can have access to meaningful work, and that is one of the best ways to solve social difficulties, but also to solve budgetary crises. When people are working, more tax revenue comes in. When there's access to meaningful work and upward pressure on wages, that is helpful to everyone. However, there are consequences to this level of debt and deficit spending. You're seeing it at the gas pump. You're seeing it at the grocery store. It's called inflation. Debt and debt financing and inflation are taxes. They're just hidden from everyone, and they hurt the poor the most and those on fixed incomes. Major corporations and others can adjust their prices, but again, people on fixed incomes who have to live paycheck to paycheck or who are stuck in jobs that don't have any upward mobility, they're hurt the most by this.
Let me ask you about the reaction on the Senate side. Your counterparts over in the Senate, particularly the ranking Republican in Appropriations, Senator Shelby, a headline from the Hill says that the senator would accept the president's $1.5 trillion budget with more for defense. Is that something you think you could support?
Well, one of the hard realities is men aren't angels, and we live in a tense, difficult world, and actually our defense mechanisms create the space for diplomacy and for appropriate economic development all across the world. In other words, defense spending ultimately is about our own security, protecting human rights, human dignity, creating the conditions for stability. It's one of the areas in which we've traditionally been able to agree on. It has to be looked at and discerned very carefully because it is one of the larger parts of the overall budget. Generally what happens is you have some agreement around defense spending levels. In a negotiation, it's combined with the health and labor bill, and the other bills tend to not get through. Remember, we're talking about 12 separate appropriations bills until the last moment when some type of agreement comes together. But the leverage point usually is defense, where you do generally have agreement between Republicans and Democrats around the fundamental issue of how to keep America safe. The spending levels, though, again, Republicans tend to want to see more emphasis on defense, since it's a critical first principle of government to keep us safe. To keep you safe, but we're in a mix at the moment as to how this is going to work itself out in deliberations with the other appropriations bills across 12 spending areas. Again, defense becomes a leverage by which we usually have some agreement around other bills. Other bills get stuck. I'm sorry, this is a little bit of insider view, but again, there's 12 appropriations bills, defense being one of them, agriculture being another, where we're working very hard, again, to create the conditions for stability for our farmers and ranchers, as well as for those who have food insecurity. And we're actually entering into a phase in which we're expanding the agricultural family, focusing on the farm of the future, young and beginning farmers, and regenerative agriculture. This has huge implications for our humanitarian assistance and our diplomacy worldwide. And again, it assists our military by creating the conditions for stability around the world so that they don't have to go in. So I'm giving you a lot of detail here as to the working components of the appropriations process because they all are affecting one another.
Jeff Fortenberry, our guest, we welcome your calls and comments. Republicans, the line is 202-748-8001. Democrats, it's 202-748-8000. And independents and others, 202-748-8002. Congressman Fortenberry, you serve on the Appropriations Subcommittee on State and Foreign Operations. You mentioned the 12 different spending bills that Congress must pass. Let's focus specifically on the relationship between the U.S. and Israel. Changes in the Israeli leadership in recent weeks with a new prime minister, a new government in Israel, and changes in the approach of the administration, the Biden administration versus the Trump administration. What do you see in that area?
Well, we just witnessed another traumatic outbreak of hostilities between Israel and the Palestinians, and obviously no one wants to see that. For decades now, we've focused on what we call the roadmap for peace based upon some earlier negotiations, but I've always had a decided view that the roadmap for peace needs a foundation. Any road needs a foundation, and that's trust. And so one of the things that I worked on for a number of years is called the Middle East Partnership for Peace Act. The former chair of Appropriations, Nita Lowey from New York, was generous enough to take the lead on that last year and help get it and got it into law. And what this does is it takes a whole new approach to going back to this fundamental idea that trust is essential before there are building blocks for peace. It builds upon traditional people-to-people exchange programs, but it also does something very innovative using a new tool that we have in diplomacy called the Development Finance Corporation to create the investment in business capital projects that will attract other investors, Israelis and Palestinians, and create projects of joint benefit. And then when politics lurches left or right or something blows up, it's really hard to unwind those types of things that are benefiting both peoples. I think that is the foundation to the roadmap for peace. I'm very pleased. I just had a dialogue with Secretary Blinken on this issue. It seems to be a priority for the administration to implement this new approach, and I hope it helps. America has a long history with Israel. Israel is a key ally, and we spend or give a definitive amount of money for Israel's protection and defense and also development. We also, and this is forgotten, America brokered the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt in 1979. After there had been 4 wars. And since then, again, we've been in the middle of that process, continuing to help Israel with their own defense, but also to help the Egyptians as well. And that is a peace model that has actually held for 40 years. It's something that we do forget, but it gives us a little bit of hope and optimism that things can change when there's courage and commitment, but also a foundation of trust.
The reporting of Haaretz on that Middle East Partnership for Peace Act, as you mentioned, $250 million over 5 years for people-to-people Israeli and Palestinian grassroots programs and joint economic ventures to boost the Palestinian economy. When you see the outbreak of violence in the Middle East, particularly between Israel and the Palestinians, does that frustrate you in terms of being able to get a project like this and make this project effective as it's intended to be?
That would be the first natural way to look at this, but I see it a little bit differently. It actually creates the conditions, the preconditions for this type of approach to be implemented even quicker. I think the time is ripe because of the conditions that you talked about earlier, coming out of another traumatic event in that area. people searching for new ways to develop understanding. And again, this has a new tool that I'm hopeful will be leveraged very aggressively to create equity investments, particularly in agricultural projects, regenerative agriculture, that benefit both Israelis and Palestinians. That's the way to create interconnectivity and solidarity and mutual benefit that can lend itself to more robust political processes. That's the hope. I think the time is ripe, actually.
You mentioned the Secretary of State. There's a headline in this morning's Washington Post about his travels this week. Blinken back in Europe as U.S. seeks to reestablish global leadership role after joining President Biden at meetings this month with European and NATO allies, as well as with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Blinken spent the afternoon here with representatives of those countries and more at an international conference on Libya. From Berlin, he travels to France and Italy for leadership talks and multilateral meetings on Syria, the Islamic State, and the Group of 20. What do you think the U.S. Relationship with the EU and those countries is now versus how it was in the Trump administration?
Well, I think there's 3 points. One is, in order to answer that question fully, you really have to go back to the post-World War II period. The world comes out of this massive conflict. Tens of millions of people are dead. The United States is cast into the role of the world's sole superpower. Out of World War II flowed a number of multilateral institutions to do one thing, to keep people at least in conversation, participating in standardizations of commerce and diplomacy that create the conditions for stability and peace. We have to tend to those things. We can forget how important they were because, again, they came out of a massive, massive conflict. That means the transatlantic alliance is very important to America. It's very important to Europe. Over the years, however, and this was President Trump's contention, and I agreed with him, that countries who benefited greatly from America's sacrifice, both in terms of our troops as well as our funds, as they advanced and developed and stabilized and became great economies themselves, have an obligation to pay a proportionate share for their own defense. It's not fair to ask American young people to potentially go die for Europeans when their young people won't do the same thing. And this was the whole contention of trying to rebalance some of the dues to NATO, some of the dues to other multilateral organizations. With that said, I think when you have a problem with friends, you hold the hand of friendship tighter. It is important to engage with the Europeans. It is important to try to find areas in which trust can be rebuilt. Even with enemies, it is always better to try to find methodologies or methods in which we can be in conversation while not being Pollyannish about it, that we're going to solve every problem in any particular administration. Remember, ultimately, this is about creating the conditions for stability and peace and opportunity for all people. In the 21st century, we have got to understand that it is defense, diplomacy, and development as a three-legged stool, underwritten by the principal foundation of justice and human dignity, which has got to become the 21st century architecture for human flourishing. Or we're simply in another types of arms race where arms get smaller and smaller, and the ability for us to inflict grave harm magnifies tremendously. That's not the right way forward. Diplomacy has a key role in trying to create the conditions for peace.
Calls for Congressman Fortenberry, 202-748-8001 for the Republican line. Democrats, 202-748-8000. And Independents, 202-748-8002. We'll go to Kathy in Leslie, Georgia, on the Republican line.
Yes, I want to talk about the budget. We do need a balanced budget, but we need to take all this pork barrel spending out of the budget and just address what our federal government was put there to accomplish in the first place, and that is to protect us and take care of our interstate highways. They've gotten into the insurance business, the food business, and I know that we need protection on some of the foods. I get that. I know we need protection on medications. But there are things in this bill that go way beyond the good and protection of our citizens and end up being just pork barrel spending that we can't afford to do. We just, as a nation, as taxpayers, I have to be responsible for how I spend my money.
Okay, Kathy. Congressman Fortenberry.
Thank you very much, Kathy, for the observation. I think you have made a number of very important points. What's going on in Washington is a very deep philosophical fight as to what the nature of government moving forward is going to be. Are we going to centralize more and more control and more spending in the hands of the federal government? Or are we going to take a more traditional view that in which we've built American opportunity on, that there are multiple levels of responsibility. The first responsibility for you is you. And I'm sure you have a family who you try to take care of well. When your credit card bill comes at the end of the month, you don't have much choice. You got to pay it. You can string it out a little while, but not too long. But the federal government has an open credit card and it can keep mass piling up debt. The problem with that is it's a hidden form of taxation, which we discussed earlier. It creates inflationary pressures. It sells our debt overseas to places like China, who then effectively are benefiting from this wealth asset shift of America to them. Built upon an earlier wealth asset shift, by the way, in which international corporations, in their infectious lust for profiteering, moved manufacturing from America to China, where there are lax labor standards and lax environmental standards. And that means they can produce goods cheaper. So they make the stuff, we buy the stuff, we run up debt, they buy our debt. It's a very dysfunctional marriage. And in the meanwhile, they build up military and are on this international march with extracting resources and paying authoritarian regimes as well as doing predatory lending toward poor countries. So there's a lot of dislocations, the point being there's a lot of dislocations when you overspend. The main one, though, is you're seeing it affect your prices in front of you for gas and for groceries and other things. So I agree with you, it's a tough slog. There's no magic answer. We just have to be very deliberate as to how we do two things at once. Have reasonable, effective government that is accountable to you, that provides good, important public goods and services, some of which you've named, while at the same time trying to provide for a healthy prosperity and growth so that people have opportunity for meaningful work. That'll help solve our problem. It's going to take time, though.
Let's go to our Democrats line here from Tom in Gleneco, Maryland. Morning.
Good morning, Congressman. Thank you for that nice comment. Could you give us some insight on how you and your colleagues in the House see the U.S. Competition or U.S. Innovation and Competition Act that the Senate passed the week before last? I think that's a $250 billion emergency supplemental. How do you view that bill?
Well, I honestly, Tom, I'd have to look at the specifics of it and the specific levels of spending, but I was encouraged by the overall trajectory of trying to get us to refocus that we cannot simply hollow out our manufacturing capacity in this country and our ability to make critical supplies for ourselves. We saw this in the pandemic when we had a shortage of basic medical equipment. And then we come to find out that most of our drugs, many of our drugs and precursors to drug ingredients are coming from overseas, a portion of which is China. The irony that where the coronavirus originated out of China is the same place in which we're dependent heavily for a lot of our drugs and drugs ingredients. So this renewed focus on trying to strengthen America internally for critical supplies, I am hopeful is a place that Democrats and Republicans could very much agree.
You are the co-chair of the Congressional Nuclear Security Group. A headline here from Fox, one of several reporting on a ransomware attack on a contractor doing some Energy Department work. How concerned are you? How confident are you in the nation's nuclear grid to be able to fend off these type of cyber attacks?
I'm highly confident. With that said, though, you're dealing with nuclear weapons, and so there is no room for error. And this is one of the reasons that we founded a nuclear security working group in Congress. I also, being from Nebraska, have the privilege of representing Strategic Command, which is our nuclear weapons command center, one of the most potent pieces of military infrastructure in the entire world, right there in Bellevue, Nebraska, hosted by Offutt Air Force Base. So we have to reduce the probability as close to zero as possible of any incident, of any attack, a digital attack, of any mistake that it could actually imperil the entire world. The commanders and the personnel who work on these issues, I assure you, are extraordinary. They're the best of the best. They're on the top of this. However, we need to be refocused as an international community on trying to prevent the next type of nuclear arms race, preventing the technology from further spreading, coming to a better understanding in which we can reduce the number of nuclear weapons while having enough for an adequate deterrent to protect ourselves. These are all the complex questions. Part of the problem is it's hard to pay attention to this when it's not an imminent threat. And after the Cold War ended, we basically moved on for a number of years. But we've seen of late Russia aggressively modernizing its nuclear capability. We are as well now, and China aggressively expanding its nuclear capability. So we have to wade back into these questions of both arms control negotiations as well as diplomatic initiatives to build trust, but also the types of vigilance to protect ourselves against any type of random attack now that the country is so digitized. But again, to your heart of your question, we have excellent personnel.
To Waynesville, North Carolina next. This is Claudia on our Republican line.
Yes, Congressman Fortenberry, I just wanted to tell you that you are a breath of fresh air. I can understand what you're saying. You're plain spoken, and I like your perspective of negotiating with other countries and working with them for big picture types of solutions rather than what we are getting into now, all of us in our country, with divisionary thinking that really doesn't seem to solve anything. And I like the perspective of that President Trump had. I don't mean to make this Republican or Democrat, but I like the perspective of peace through strength and the Abraham Accord, and that we were proud to be an ally with Israel. And I just liked that format, and I hope that you can move up to a great power position in government. You have a good head on your shoulders and truly a breath of fresh air, and I thank you for your service.
Okay, Claudia.
Claudia, you've lifted my spirit. Thank you so much for your generous comments. I'm extraordinarily proud to be a member of the United States Congress. I've always believed that public service is an honorable and high calling. And it's my sincere hope that, given all of the difficulties that we've faced of late, that somehow we can regain this sense that, again, being in public service is exactly that, simply being here to help, leaning into the most complex, difficult problems, but a focus really on one fundamental: human dignity. Every person matters, every person counts, and how do we create a more just and orderly society where every person not only matters, but their life can flourish. That not only applies to us here in America, but that's got to, again, be the 21st century architecture for human relations worldwide. I think most people around the world simply want to have the ability to use their own two hands in their mind to create something good, to provide for themselves and for their family, and to have a healthy form of nationalism and a certain pride in their culture. And so I think if we can always try to focus on these fundamentals, and again, it creates that space for human dialogue, the possibility of trust, the possibility of friendship, and that's really, really important for peace.
As the ranking Republican on the Agriculture Committee, I want to ask you about the drought in the West. The headline this morning on Slate: heat dome and drought are threatening to ignite the West. Congressman Fortenberry, are we getting any indication of how badly this will affect U.S. food supply and cattle supply, beef supply in the country in the coming months?
Well, we've had some volatility in the commodity markets, some major shifts. Overall, commodities have done well. Now, this is part of the inflationary problem. One of the other deeper issues, though, before I touch that, is as we saw during the pandemic, it surged and then quickly went away. But there was a moment there where we were very concerned about our food supply. This is not something that we readily consider. We have the lowest grocery prices in the world. We don't even think about where our food comes from because we have a massive amount of steady supply based upon the stewardship of our farmers and ranchers and our incredible natural resources, plus the fact that we have a very innovative and technologically sophisticated system, a lot of which flows out of our university land grant systems. These are all foundational elements for, again, civilized order in any society. When you go overseas, one of the most important people that you see in governments and other places is the Minister of Agriculture. We don't tend to do that here because we take it for granted. Weather patterns and weather events can come and go, but thankfully we have a very diverse food supply, but we'll keep an eye on this issue. We have the Drought Mitigation Center actually at the University of Nebraska that actually monitors these events. But again, the reason I'm telling you all this is agriculture is essential to human flourishing and societal well-being. One of the other issues, though, in the cattle markets is the concentration of slaughter capacity. And back when the pandemic hit and you had some coronavirus outbreaks in plants, because we have 4 plants controlling 80% of the slaughter capacity in this country, when you have a backup, you can't hold an animal back for very long when you have a plant go down, and this causes supply chain disruptions. So there was a moment there when we were in steady dialogue with the Secretary of Agriculture to make sure that we were in front of this problem. You also saw some food being wasted because it couldn't get to market because of transportation and logistical supply constraints. The Department of Agriculture put together a very innovative program to move that food into the hands of people who needed it through food banks. So we've got a very sound and secure agricultural system. We protect people who have food insecurity through our government programs. We have extraordinary community organizations around the country to give food to those who are in need. But it all comes from, again, this incredible gift of natural resources we have and the value of stewardship and innovation that our farmers and ranchers bring.
Let's hear from Eileen in Brick, New Jersey on the Independent line.
Oh, yes. Good morning, Mr. Fortenberry.
Hi.
It's so good to listen to you. I just want to say something, and then I have a question I would like to ask, and I hope that you can give me a direct answer. First of all, I want to say since this administration has been in power, this country has gotten much worse. It's going down and down, and I don't think I have to mention what that is with the racism, the crime, the cost of everything, the cost of gasoline. Now, next, I have a question for you. When is someone going to do something about Joe Biden? He is not a well man. Anyone who is half intelligent can tell just to look at him.
Eileen, I'm going to let you go there. We're running short, but Congressman Fortenberry, care to respond to that or just want to wrap up with some other comments?
Sure. I think Eileen makes a first good point in the sense that crime and inflation and illegal border crossings are surging in this country. There has to be a very deliberate mechanism in which crime is stopped. This is unfair and unjust, and that is in the hands of primarily local police departments. We're going through an important national conversation about the reforms of police so that it can be more based on relationship, community policing, and then use of force when necessary, but as it flows out of relationship with the communities in need. That's one very important way to stop crime. Inflation is related to the overspending in Washington and economic dislocations. Again, that's a tax on the poor and those with fixed incomes, fundamentally unfair. And finally, we didn't get to talk too much today about the crisis on the border. You cannot have a just and orderly immigration system when there is chaos and disorder at your border. All important issues that we need to focus on, but then if we can do it with solidarity and critical thinking and stop pointing fingers at one another, then we can get underneath this and get back to work and restore our confidence and sense of greatness in this country.
He's in his 9th term in the U.S. House. Congressman Jeff Fortenberry